All right, we are live here for the Unscripted Mental Health Chat. Let me fix this. Whoa, I'm all off balance. It's like, okay, so we are here for the Mental Health Unscripted conversation where we talk about things related to mental health every Sunday at 7 o'clock Eastern Time Zone. We cannot guarantee confidentiality. So please do chat, but please do chat at your own risk. I still will not call out who's saying what in the chat to try to keep it somewhat anonymous on that. Of course, everyone can do the very intuitive or in what is it when we're thinking of something for the first time, ingenuitive. Man, there's a word that I'm so close to. It's not intuitive. Anyway, I can't remember that word, but you know what I'm talking about. We can all sound really clever by saying our friend is struggling with a mental health concern and we're asking for a friend. No one will know that that's really us. But anyway, we're here to talk about anything related to mental health, even sometimes obscurely related to mental health. So feel free to ask different questions. We went through the ACT workbook recently. I'm not going to go through any specific material today because I didn't get really feedback one way or the other about whether people wanted to do more workbooks or if they wanted to keep it more informal and casual to different conversations. But I am here to talk about anything mental health related, and in lieu of not having questions in the chat, I will just talk about anything that comes to mind related to my mental health stuff. Okay, we've got our first question here. What are helpful ways to handle boundaries in the workplace? I was one of the worst at boundaries, especially in the workplace at first, because it's like people have different psychological makeups that motivate them for different things. I was a performer, so like psychologically I wanted to get an A all the time. I wanted to achieve, and when I had a boss that was always asking for more and nothing that I did was ever really good enough, it would put me in this place where I started to just have other areas of my life diminish as I focused way too much on the job. So I think part of the thing is understanding your psychological influences and knowing where you're going to struggle. I was talking about abusive relationships recently with some friends, and there are some people that it's never great to be in a relationship. Thank you for the like. I got somebody who gave a like. Never great to be in a relationship that's abusive, of course. But some people have no problem leaving it, and other people get stuck in it. So all that to say is give yourself some grace. You might have a hard time with workplace boundaries because you're still internalizing some feeling of not being enough deep down, some issues with your parents and not feeling like whatever you did was enough or they approved of you, and then playing out that work drama in that role of like, if I have a boss that says I'm enough, then I'll feel like enough. Carl Jung says, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will drive our life and we'll call it fate. So there's a lot of practical ways of setting boundaries and expectations. I'll get to those in a second. But in terms of as a therapist, like in the intrinsic stuff, working through why it's hard for us and what is our motivation and where do we find our worth is really important. So the follow-up question was specifically with coworkers who are pushy and mean. And I do think that still relates because, I got 2 more likes. Thanks, guys. That you have to be able to withstand that cruelty and not personalize it. And so for that, realizing who you are and having confidence in what you bring to the table is part of it. Now, that does not mean, to be clear, that I need to present that to that person. I don't need to prove to them that I'm worth it. And I think people get in a bad habits when they try to do that. They're like, I know my worth, so I'm going to tell them my worth. If you know your worth, you don't have to tell people your worth. You can just live in it. And then when they have a reaction, it's on them, not on you. Okay, so in terms of practical strategies here and communication, over communication and communicating early and often are huge. So before you have a meeting, setting the tone preemptively can be really helpful, right? I want to make sure that, and this is how I would say it, right? So maybe a little bit trying to be clever on not calling them out for being pushy or mean, but saying, look, I want to make sure that I never push you, that you don't push me, that we are mutually supportive and cooperative, and we have a really healthy work relationship. So I think it's going to be really important to set some ground rules on this conversation, like da 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 da. I don't say, in the past you've been a jerk and you push me around all the time, and that needs to stop. That's usually going to respond with some defensiveness, maybe some attacking back, and it's an escalating thing. So accusations are escalators. We want to de-escalate. So looking at any time that you can be pushy or mean and starting there and talking about how you want to make sure that you stay positive and encouraging and communicating that often. And again, especially in the beginning days, at the beginning of our interactions will be huge. So specifying before we even start what our expectations are for that conversation, if that makes sense. All right. So not getting another question in the chat yet. Let me think of a default topic that I want to talk about mental health wise. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the ego. So ego is something that is not, if you look at the Freud definition of ego, it's very much about just our consciousness. So the part of us that's aware is our ego. But as we have progressed in language, there's this concept that we've started to define ego as, sometimes as pride. But I think if we can be a little bit more accurate, it's more like this part of ourself that is evaluating how we are doing, right? Now, some of us might have a codependent way of looking at that because we're constantly scanning other people's behavior around us to try to see if we're behaving well. But ultimately, it's still going to be up to us and our idea of ourselves, the self-referencing, that allows us to see whether we're good enough or bad enough. So that is my definition of ego. Okay, we got a question in the chat. Can you talk about the importance of community to our mental health, and how do you encourage your clients to handle building connection to a healthy community? Absolutely, I'd be more than happy to. So when it comes down to it, connection and purpose are the two things that create joy in people's lives. So being in a connected community, and it doesn't really matter if that community is small or big, and having a purpose where you know you have a central place in that community. Those two things are the key to happiness in life. Sometimes throughout our lives, we develop different struggles and different patterns of trust issues, different things that make us want to fear rejection, isolate from community. So in terms of building a healthy connection in community, one of the things is we want to make sure that it fits with us purposefully and who we want to be. So my filter for this is I want people that are focused on growth, right? Whether it is physical, emotional, spiritual, they're trying to find some way of improving. I find that I'm very compatible with those people, even if we're in different places, because we're focused on where can we grow, right? Ultimately, a lot of people don't love change, struggle to try to progress, and are looking to find places where they can feel comfortable. That's fine, and there's some areas that we should have that in life, But if that's every area of your life, you're probably not my people, right? So finding a group of people that have a similar purpose for you, I think is even better than finding people that have similar likes, right? We'll go, oh yeah, we're going to get around people that are really into sports. I'm really into sports. We can all be into sports together. Yeah, but if they're into sports in a way of tearing each other down because they like, that kind of crap talking stuff, and you're not into that, your values are different, your purpose is different, they're not compatible. So when I would say encouraging clients to build connection with people that they see that have a purposeful community and a lifestyle which they would one day want. Okay, so how do you find purpose? How do you find your purpose? I think a lot of this comes down to framing, if I'm being honest, right? So don't get me wrong, eventually it should lead to action, but ultimately, like, our purpose is something that we usually are doing to some degree, whether we realize we're doing it or not. And labeling it, giving it intentionality does make an impact, right? So even if we did the same things we did yesterday tomorrow, but now from a state of purpose, we'll have more joy, it'll have more worth. So sometimes what can be the first start is to looking at the things in your life that feed you, right? That you feel fulfilled. Now that might be, you might be tired, you might be exhausted from it, but at the end you're like, man, that was worth doing. And starting to put together the pieces of like, what's the connection between all of the things that you find worth doing, right? Where's the threads in that? And I say threads because it might be multiple. There might be some threads that are about connecting with others, some threads that are about things you are passionate about, like music or dancing, athletics, crafting, right? Creating stuff. Okay, so the follow-up question: How do you find this joy-filled purpose at your job? Me specifically, obviously I'm in a helping profession, so that was one for my purpose. It's pretty clear from an early age that I wanted to help people. In fact, I got into pastoral ministry first because I felt like that was going to be the thing that helped the most people. Then I eventually figured out that there was a lack of tools, that there were some things that I needed for myself and could then help people better. So I went back to school, got my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, because I wanted to get the best tools I could to help as many people as possible. So I find joy by focusing on how I'm helping people, right? By focusing on that's my common thread. And if I look at like all the things that spark joy in my life, again, there are multiple. It's not like that's the only thing, but that's one of the most common, is that if I can help people, I feel purpose. So we spend a lot of time at our job, and the job doesn't have to, like, let's say you have a purpose for helping people. Your job could be almost anything, and there is a way in which you're going to be helping people in that job. So focusing on that aspect of the job will help with purpose, even if you keep the same job. Okay, the person said, I think I meant, what about folks who might find themselves in a dead-end job they don't like? So that's good. So that's kind of what I'm saying. So like, for instance, my brother ended up switching these jobs because he was in a cubicle, and I'm talking about your mindset and perspective for sure, right? Can be helpful. Now, this is a good example, I think, because it does show balance here, right? My brother eventually did leave his job that was in a cubicle for a job that he was teaching, because as an extrovert, he needed more interaction. I think that was a good move, and that came from a sense of knowing himself and knowing where he ultimately was going to be happy. However, so this is the balance, right? sometimes there is big life changes that we need to make. Everything in therapy can come down to it depends, right? Which is why it helps to have a therapist work through this with you individually. But for my brother, surviving in the cubicle meant he needed to find ways to interact with people that helped keep his sanity. And most of the people in that job were introverted people. So he was extroverted, but most of them were introverted. So he had to do something to catch them. So he would do like things like he brought in this, or I think he actually made this little basketball game that was like almost like, the thing where you flick the thing and you have the score for the football little paper game that they play, like table game. It was like a basketball version of that he then used to start conversations with people and keep himself engaged in that way. Right? So even if you're at a job that doesn't naturally kind of suit you, you can still find ways to focus on purpose and meaning and connection that does work for you. And they've even done a study on this. Like one really famous study was about people that clean a hospital. So there was the maintenance staff of the hospital. And when asked to describe their job, some described the mechanics of their job, and those were people with very low job satisfaction. And some described, this is the gist of the study, and I've seen stuff that challenged this study, but I think the gist of the study is true. The people that thought of their job as helping people get well, even though their aspect of the job was just cleaning the floors, did a better job at the job, had more purpose, enjoyed their job more, enjoyed their life more, right? And so, yeah, that mindset shift can be huge. So when it goes back to circling back to the question of how do you find your purpose, I think a big thing is looking at the patterns of what's sparking joy in your life and then leaning into those things. But your life probably has more meaning than you give it credit for. And part of having a purpose-driven life is about finding meaning in the life that you already have. Sometimes we do make shifts, but we shouldn't jump to that first. We should jump to mindset shifts first. It seems like we can get stuck, this is a comment, it seems like we can get stuck in a negative loop regarding work. Suggestions on how to stop the loop or have a mindset shift. Okay, so like one of the things that a lot of people, and I don't like using the word joy because it doesn't actually produce joy long term, but we can become habitual complainers. We can learn to develop the muscle of discontentment. I've definitely done this in my life where we're focusing on everything negative. So some of the time the reason we're stuck in a negative feedback loop when it comes to our work is because we get too comfortable complaining about the job, right? So we're basically asking our brain to highlight all the parts of the job that we don't like rather than the parts that we do. Now, it doesn't help that our brain is hardwired to focus on negativity because that's more important when it comes to safety than positivity. So when it's the threat of being eaten or killed is very high, then you want to be very quick at spotting anything that is a potential risk, anything that is potentially off, anything that is wrong. And normally our brains don't notice all the things that are right. So gratitude can be a way that we practically start practicing building a skill set to see all these wonderful things about our job. And good answer about what's your purpose. Thank you. So if we start to practice gratitude, now one thing that I would say is if you're trying to shift from being someone who's complaining to being someone who's very grateful and talks about all the things that are going well, let's balance it and don't try to make the shift too quick. Okay. a negative feedback loop. Well, if I'm complaining about my ability to complain, right? If I'm beating myself up about beating myself up, I'm not going to be more positive. Instead, build it alongside it. So in other words, start a habit where this is just one idea, an example, find out what works for you. But like every complaint about your job, you allow. Hey, it's part of life. We can't be positive all the time. But then list a couple things that you are grateful for and that are positive. All right. So the question got back to me. What if it doesn't feel authentic? Like I'm faking being grateful. I think in some ways there is no avoiding that it's going transition always feels a little awkward. And so anything you do that's new is going to feel awkward. It's not going to feel then genuine, right? Because it's not automatic. That's what we actually mean, right? So is it authentic? Well, ask yourself this. Is it something to be grateful for? If it's a general good practice to be grateful for it, then it's a great thing to practice gratitude, right? So for instance, the air I breathe is not something I generally think about being grateful for. But is it disingenuous saying I'm really grateful that I'm able to breathe right now? No, and if I couldn't breathe right now, I would all of a sudden be filled with genuine gratitude when the breath returned, right? If the oxygen was sucked out of the room and I couldn't breathe and all of a sudden it came back, like in a Total Recall type of way from that one scene in Total Recall, I'd be very grateful for the turning the oxygen back on. So if I'm practicing gratitude on the ability to breathe, it might feel forced, but it doesn't mean it isn't genuine. So I would give it time and keep up the practice and see, but make sure that what you're choosing gratitude on are all good things to be grateful for that align with your values, right? Feelings will go all over the place. You know, there are times you're going to feel a bunch of different things about any of these patterns and habits. The thing that you're asking yourself is the things that you're doing daily, that you're cultivating, are they taking you in the direction that you want your life to go? Talk boundaries with people when you weren't aware you had them. Might need a little bit more of an explanation. I can do my best. Talk boundaries with people when you weren't aware you had them. I'm not sure if you're saying you weren't aware that you had the boundaries, or about a period of time when I had boundaries but wasn't aware of it. Talk boundaries with people when you weren't aware you had. It's probably more my reading it than your comment. Your comment probably makes more sense than my brain right now. People when you weren't aware you had them. Yeah, I'm going to need a clarification on that statement. Doesn't the tendency to feel fake partly, it doesn't, yes, I don't have boundaries. Okay, gotcha. Okay. Doesn't the tendency to feel, I'll get back to that, tendency to feel fake partly because of what you just said about your brain's coming up with negatives? Yeah, so like, again, we got to clarify when we mean fake, whether we're talking about being forced or disingenuous, right? We don't want to be disingenuous, but we kind of do need to force it, because if we're just doing what is natural at any moment, we are going to be drawn to the negative. And then we start getting frustrated that our life becomes more and more negative, but we're actually programming our brain to do that. So not intensely, slowly, but willfully, we are looking to produce more gratitude, and eventually that muscle becomes stronger and bigger, and then it becomes automatic at a certain point, right? Because we build that habit up over time. So, you know, when it comes to setting boundaries, and there's a great book on boundaries by, I think, want to say Dr. Henry McLeod, something like that. The name might be a little off, but it's the primary book on boundaries. It goes through a bunch of different examples of healthy boundaries, And I found it helpful because I was really bad at boundaries, and some of them have stuck with me, of like realizing where to create boundaries. But one of the things that I often say to people when they're going from not having any boundaries to learning to have boundaries, a couple things. One is expect resistance. People even that tell you that you should create boundaries and know you have an issue with boundaries will still not like when you set boundaries with them. People want you to set boundaries with everyone else, but not with them, right? So expect resistance. Also, expect yourself to be really bad at setting boundaries. And you can't wait for yourself to be perfect at setting boundaries. So ideally, when we set boundaries, we do it in love, we do it very clearly, we do it very carefully. It's a very reasonable boundary, and we're gently saying the boundary, right? Only as firm as is necessary is probably another way to say it. But yeah, Dr. Henry McLeod, thank you for that. Yeah. But when you first start at something, you're not going to do it perfectly. And that needs to be okay. Now, you can help yourself out a little bit by telling the person you're setting the boundaries, hey, I'm not great at setting these boundaries. All right. So this might sound a little overly harsh, or maybe this isn't even a reasonable boundary, but I'm working at setting these boundaries. And this is what I think I need to do. Right. So sorry if this comes out cold, but it's one of the things that I'm working on. And if they're going to like try to manipulate you or push you out of setting that boundary, this should be at least a yellow flag. And we should show caution when it comes to that person, because they might not be a super safe person. Whereas a super safe person, even if they don't love that boundary, is for you setting boundaries so they're able to, practice. And sometimes you can even ask somebody to help you practice, like setting the boundary of knowing how to say no, or even like saying no without needing an explanation of why. And you can basically say, hey, I'm wanting to practice this. Can you help me? Right. And by the way, going back to even that pushy, this is a little bit of being super clever about stuff. But you could even try it with that pushy employee that someone else asked about, right? That is always pushing against your boundaries, and actually say to that person, hey, I'm practicing learning how to say no and trying to be better at setting boundaries. If every once in a while you'd make an unreasonable request just for me to practice saying no, I'd find that very helpful. And they're like, most people are kind of down to that. They're like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. That sounds kind of fun, right? Well, then the advantage is if you have to set boundaries on other things, you're going back to we were working on me saying no. Oh, I guess that's true, right? And you've taken an enemy and you've created an advocate out of it. So just, maybe a little bit of a keep your friends close, but your enemies closer kind of way of working with people. But the biggest thing that I would say is when you don't have boundaries, you're learning where and how to set them. Give yourself grace. You're probably going to do it sloppy, and that's okay. But it matters more that you have a boundary. Now, let me be clear on what I mean by boundary, because I do think there's a big difference between boundary and expectations. Boundaries are about how I let other people treat me and where I stop, right? So in other words, I'm willing to go to this place and not further, right? And I'm willing to allow this treatment of me and not worse. Those are the things that were the gist of setting boundaries, okay? Expectations are a little bit different, and they get confused a lot. Now, they overlap only in this. If I have an expectation of you, but you have a self boundary and they're not compatible, we're going to have an issue, right? And so that's one of the things to look at. Weird thing in my hair. I don't know what that. It's distracting me. Sorry, guys. ADHD moment. So expectations are what I set on other people and what I want them to do. We should keep our expectations very low of others. So having high expectations sets up conflict later. One phrase says, unspoken expectations are premeditated resentments. So I'm expecting everybody to do all these different things for me, say all these things. Like, okay, so let me think of an example, right? If I have an expectation that if I take someone to lunch, they're going to take me to lunch, right? And it's not spoken, it's an expectation. Get ready to feel hurt and taken advantage of, because you are probably setting yourself up, because they're expecting, very likely, as human beings do, you to continue to pay for their lunch because that's what you did before. And what people naturally expect is that it's going to work the same way it did last time. But if your expectation is they're going to reciprocate, right? You're actually setting up a script there. You're setting up a predictable conflict. Now, if I said something like, hey, I've got this kind of policy that I like to, be the one to pay for the person's lunch if I invite them. And I would love if you invited me out sometimes, but this one invitation is on me, so this one's on me. You could see how they respond. They might say, yeah, I don't really want to do that, but I'm happy to get the free lunch, right? Or they might be like, that sounds great. Yeah, okay, it sounds good. I'll take you out for the next one. Okay, cool. Now, I'm still an expectation, right? But at least it's a one that we've verbalized and talked about. Boundary is basically more like, this is where the overlap is, somebody assuming that I'm going to pay for their lunch every single time because I paid for it before, right? I'm going to set a boundary. I'm only going to pay for your lunch on these occasions. When I, for instance, this one, when I invite you, right? Does that make sense? So figuring out healthy boundaries sounds very trial and error, or at least kind of messy. Yeah, for sure, especially when you've never done it, right? You got to figure out where you can set those boundaries and what are the limits that end up setting you up for success long term. So if you're feeling more and more empty and having more and more resentment in any relationship, then part of the problem is probably a lack of boundaries. And, look, there are some toxic people that we just cannot live at peace with because they're just going to have bad patterns. And usually that's from them needing therapy. But in general, with most people, owning our part and realizing how we've influenced them to feel like this is what the expectations are can be huge. For the longest time, I was a walking martyr complex and kind of presented myself as someone who was always willing to do for others and never expected anything in return. So I shouldn't have been surprised when people didn't have a lot of loyalty, didn't really sacrifice for me. That feeling that, people have like, well, eventually they're going to reciprocate, right? It's just, that's not human nature. We're setting ourselves up to be more and more empty and feeling more and more taken advantage of. Yes, it definitely is messy, LOL. Sounds like clarity and actual verbal communication is important. Yeah, and it's not against the rules. It's actually one of the most powerful tools we have as human beings, that we can talk through the process and verbalize what we're thinking. And even if we're not clear-minded on it, we can verbalize both sides, right? We can explain, this is the part of me that feels this way, and this is the part of me that feels that way. Okay, this is now reading a comment. Individualized for each person too. Sounds exhausting. So how do I figure out what my general boundaries should be? Creating a system that works for you is huge, right? Everyone has it different. So there are some people that love being around people and they don't really have to set a boundary with their time because they're extroverted. There are other people that are going to be really drained, and so they do have to set very firm boundaries on how much time they spend. So that would be a good example of a generalized boundary, right? Is, for instance, I've got one. Now, I make exceptions to this, but when it comes to my time, I ask that for notice. I'm not somebody that like you can call last minute and be like, want to hang out right now? I'm going to probably tell you, I really could use some notice. I might do it one time or two, but then I am going to verbalize in that time, hey, you'd be setting me up for success and our friendship up to grow if you give me a little more notice next time. And, just even a day ahead, I can emotionally prepare because I make plans and I'm introverted and it takes me a while to kind of like have in mind when I'm going to do something, right? That I don't know if that answered your question, but I might circle back to it. Okay, another comment. Totally reminds me of my brother set a harsh but necessary boundary. Reminds me, you set a harsh but necessary boundary. Much later adjusted it, which with close to zero expectations, LOL. But it is actually working out because now I can adjust boundaries as I experience how he acts. Yeah. The first time we have to set a boundary, sometimes we do have to set it very harshly. It's probably because we've been practicing some codependency and we haven't been clear on our boundaries in the past. And I had this exact experience. I had this honestly with some of my family members. I had some conflicts with some people in my family because they were not used to me setting any boundaries. And when then all of a sudden I was setting these boundaries, I was setting them pretty harshly and overly harshly. Yes. Could I now set those boundaries far more gently and probably less of extreme boundaries? Yeah, but I couldn't have gotten to the point where I could set them more gently without practice. So I first had to be really messy and, another person commented, this all sounds exhausting. I remember talking about over communication with a client, and what over communication is, and this is my term, so this isn't a clinical term, but is where I'm not only communicating what I mean, I'm communicating what I don't mean. So making very thorough statements to say, hey, this is what I'm saying, and I'm not saying this, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying this. Especially when I know the person has a tendency to assume and take to an extreme the things that I'm saying, right? So that's actually a great example of dialectical behavioral therapy does this for setting boundaries with people with borderline personality disorder. So if I'm not the person that's suffering, but I'm trying to help the person that's suffering, people with borderline personality disorder often feel very threatened when you set a boundary because they have attachment issues and they feel like you might be abandoning them. So an over communication thing is I'm saying, hey, you were yelling at me and talking to me in an extreme manner. That's not appropriate. So I'm going to step away from this conversation. It doesn't mean I don't love you, and I am going to be back in 1 hour. I'm just going to go on a walk, spend some time listening to music, and then we'll continue this conversation, hopefully in a more mutually loving and supportive way, right? So that's over communication. I'm communicating what I am doing, but I'm also communicating what I'm not doing. I'm not abandoning the conversation, and I'm not abandoning you, right? I was talking to a client about that principle, and their response was, that sounds exhausting. And they were having a conflict with their significant other at the time. And I said, okay, well, this current conflict that you're having with your significant other, if you use this principle of over communication, when you first had the incident, because they were feeling insecure, and you communicated in a way where you were saying, I'm not attacking you, I'm not saying you did anything wrong, I just want to verbalize my insecurity. Do you think you still would have had this fight? And they said, no. I said, okay, how long have you had this fight now? It's like it was the third day they had the fight. Okay. I said, how many hours have you been arguing about this? And it was like, I don't even know, countless, like a bunch of hours. It's like, okay, so you're telling me that it would take more energy to communicate in this way initially than it has to do all of the fighting? So here's where the rubber meets the road. There's no way around that doing anything for the first time or new feels really messy, feels really exhausting, takes a lot of mental concentration. Absolutely. Which again is why you got to give yourself grace as you do it. Expect the change to work slow and expect it to take time. But at a certain point, it'll be so intuitive that you'll naturally be setting boundaries with people without having it be exhausting. You'll be doing it gentler, you'll be doing it consistently, and you'll also know what relationships you have to set what boundaries on without even thinking about it. You don't even realize you're doing it, right? This is the mouse in the maze thing. Like if you have the mouse with the cheese and the maze example, the first time they take forever to find the cheese. They're sniffing all over the place. The brain is super active. Next time, a little less. They find the cheese a little quicker. At a certain point, they can find that cheese blindfolded and they just go right to it and their brain doesn't even light up, right? That's our brains are always working for efficiency. Before we make the change, the problem is our brains are really efficient about bad habits, right? We got those down pat. I used to say my brain was an expert at worrying. I could take any topic and I could find something to worry about. Even if it was something that good that happened, I can now worry about missing out. Our brains like safety too. Yes, that's a good comment. Very true. Probably the smartest thing my therapist ever said is the brain's job is not to make us happy, but to keep us safe. So that's why it often is our enemy, because it likes safety and it likes predictability. That will keep you exactly where you are now. Now, looking at the gratitude, negativity, complaining thing again, let's not miss out on how often our brains are actually healthy. The thing is, we probably don't realize all of the good habits we already have. We're not thinking about all the things that our brain is functioning as it is supposed to when we are able to connect with people, when we're able to have good conversations and good relationships, when we're doing things that is healthy. We've completely neglected paying attention to all those things, or at least most people have. We are focusing on the part of ourselves that still needs improvement. And again, that's natural and that's okay. But balancing that with realizing how many things that you do that is healthy can be helpful. And for those things, what the things that are actually working, our brain is working as it's supposed to. The safety, the predictability is actually keeping us in a good spot, right? And so, one, there are many things that you are doing now that your brain is working great and you're in a good spot. You don't even have to think about it. That's awesome, right? Without a specific example other than like somatic stuff of like your heart is beating in rhythm for most of you. You're breathing. You weren't even consciously aware that you were doing it, right? And it's your brain is doing that, regulating that really efficiently and subconsciously. So I quoted earlier Carl Jung, until we make the unconscious conscious, it'll drive our life, we'll call it fate. Well, of course, even that phrase is focused on the things that we're unconsciously doing that aren't healthy. But there's so many unconscious things that we're doing that are healthy that we don't even think about. It's when we realize, oh, there's this unconscious pattern that I've got that isn't healthy, that it takes the extra time, energy, and effort to go, oh, got to bring that part into the conscious, right? That pattern I've got isn't super healthy. I've got to adjust it. And so I'm going to bring it back into my consciousness. I'm going to think about the ways that I could improve it. And then I'm going to put it back into the subconscious, now in a healthier version where I'm functioning in a better way. Right? So hopefully that answers the question of why it does feel like a lot of effort at first, but eventually it's not going to be much effort at all. All right, so my chat is going a little quiet. You guys have been doing great, by the way. Really appreciate all the questions and all the chat. But I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go the whole hour today, but I'm gonna go back to the ego thing. Okay, so what we really want to watch out for when it comes to our self-regard, how we see and view ourselves, is not what we first think about of worrying about pride or shame. Obviously, we don't want to be on either extremes of that, right? But our brains are kind of hot wired to think about, or hardwired, you could say, actually, probably a better way to say it, to think about how we're doing, to constantly be evaluating. This is the part of us that is pushing us to progress, right? What instead we want to do to balance that is a term called ego fixation reduction. Fancy word to just saying, don't let how well you're doing in any avenue of your life be your overall focus and gravitational pull, right? How do we do that? Going all the way back to purpose, right? Seeing that you are just one element of this system. Now, some people are internal locus of control and some people are external. Some people are constantly looking at all the outside forces that are affecting their life. It's not fair. I have to deal with this. I have to deal with that. It's like all these people, and this is all their fault. And other people are overly responsible. They take things that are even other people's behavior and be like, it must be my fault. I must have set them up wrong. I must have done all that stuff. And like many things in life, the healthiest is usually somewhere in the balance. Seeing that you are one piece, you are not the whole system. I want to be a good steward and responsible for my part in my life, my job, my relationships. But I'm also practicing at the same time acceptance of myself, my limitations, acceptance of the people I work with, what they're like. So if the goal, going back to like setting boundaries with a mean, pushy person at work, is for that person to no longer be mean or pushy, that's not a great goal. It's not an acceptance goal. My only route to that, to changing that person, would be manipulation, right? The only direct result. Rather, I want to accept this is going to be somebody who can be mean and pushy. The boundary is what level of effort and access can I give to that person, right? Without it causing my life distress. So when it comes to triggers, I talk about this sometimes, but it also goes with being around negative influences. If I'm risking losing my sense of values and not living my life in a way that I feel is best for me, right? Fitting my overall purposes and values in life, then I'm being overly influenced, overly triggered, and I need to set a boundary, right? I need to spend some time somewhere else. I need to, do whatever it can to not focus on that person and that thing. Someone said, I'm the overly responsible one, but trying not to be. I'm glad you said it, so I didn't have to. Yeah, no, and I used to be from a very early age. And going all the way back to that ego thing, for me, it was a low self-regard. I started to create a sense of worth. I actually think my low self-regard was actually, if I'm being as specific as possible was from a lack of feeling connection. So I felt misunderstood a lot in my early childhood and with my peers. Like I was a young adult when I was like a kindergartner. So an old soul, as they could say, right? Learning how to self-love, someone said. And yeah, I felt like an alien. I, I didn't feel like I connected with my peers. I didn't really like, so I was wondering what's wrong with me. And so that's what developed my low self-regard. Then I found I could perform a specific task really well. And then people started treating me better and connecting with me. So that became my focus. And I lost my self-identity in codependency and being overly responsible because, not surprisingly, goes with martyr complex, codependency, people pleasing, my role was helper. Now you might ask yourself, wait a second, your role is still helper. Now I'm a helper with boundaries. And honestly, like that's one of the things, even with therapy, I like being a therapist because I get to set boundaries in a lot easier way than when I was in ministry. People pay for my time, and I'm not apologetic about that, right? It's clear, it's one-on-one, and I'm there for them in that time period. They pay for it, and I do everything I can to help them have the tools for self-growth in that time. When I was in pastoral, those boundaries were not as clear. So it was really systematically set up for them to be more likely of taking advantage of me. All right? I'm not even blaming them, nor am I blaming myself. That was a system problem, and it's a really good example of setting up better boundaries. I genuinely care just as much as I did before. I love helping people just as much as I do before. I have actually a better tool set than I used to. And actually people's lives are getting predictably better way faster than before when I was in ministry because I was doing it from a codependent fashion. I wanted to be their savior. I wanted to help. I had to prove my worth to help them. Now that I have this positive self-regard where I love myself much more and have this self-acceptance, I just get to give people an opportunity for them to work on themselves and give the tools. And that's where they actually end up walking away with self-confidence and empowerment, and their life gets better, right? Because they're not just leaning on me, they're building their own confidence in who they are, right? Does that make sense? So that overly responsible role, for me at least, came from wanting to connect, wanting to be understood, and feeling alien, and then finding a role in which I could connect with people, but it became task oriented. So I had to keep performing that role or people would reject me and nobody really loved me. And then, at one point in my life, that my worst nightmare came true and everybody did reject me and it did feel like the end of the world. But that's actually where I did start to find self-regard, because I couldn't keep performing the role. And I knew no matter what, I wasn't going to get validation and affirmation from other people in that season. So now I had to take a real look at myself. And it took a lot of work. It took therapy. It wasn't pretty. But slowly over time, I started to build a self-identity that was not about performing a specific role. And someone did point out in the chat, not everyone rejected me. And that's true. Yeah, you're right. And that's a generalization that I'm falling into that we normally do, where we highlight the negative. A lot of people rejected me, but not everybody. There were some people that stuck by me and transitioned from knowing me as the martyr complex to knowing me as a much more balanced individual, relatively speaking. Am I perfectly balanced? No. Do I perfectly have good, positive self-regard? No. It's still a process, but now my default engine is far healthier than it was before. And my community, yes, as someone said, your community just got a little smaller, a lot smaller, but a lot healthier too, right? So I have way less people in my life than I used to, way less praise. I used to have people talk about how awesome I was all the time, and it was exhausting having to keep that up, right? To be that Superman for all these other people, to be that savior. But it was great being affirmed all the time, having people tell me all the time how impressive I am. Very few people describe me as impressive anymore. But I do have people that I know authentically love me. Thank you. Excellent episode 26. I'm learning how to love myself and say no without guilt. Awesome. Yeah. And I think that one thing that hopefully my story will encourage you as a like cautionary encouragement, right? A realistic road ahead is that you will have people that reject you as you learn to love yourself and have good boundaries, because the version of you that they were attached to is changing. But it ends up maybe being a smaller community, but a way healthier one of people that really do love you for you and really do see you, and you really do get that connection. And it's a lot easier to build a much healthier self-regard in that. And that's enough. Like for me, it definitely becomes enough, right? So you got to be willing to go through the exhaustion of learning the new habits, the rejection of the people that liked you the way you used to be. But you will find people that are healthier community and a better sense of purpose. With that said, we're about at time. Thank you so much. This chat was one of my favorite chats. I really do appreciate everybody who contributed into the chat. You guys are all awesome. I love you guys. Please, if you're watching this later, tune in next time, 7 o'clock Eastern time zone on Sunday. I try to be consistent with every Sunday. And yeah, I hope you have mental health, and hope you keep working on yourself and progressing and know that you're loved. All right. You guys are awesome. Thanks again. And hope you have a great week.